so you then got an actually conflict between that way of thinking and the other, metropolitan scale, and a lot of activists turned back to the local Jane Jacobs as a radical and left the metropolitan up to anybody who wanted to take care of it. In other words, they didn't take care of that scale at all. So you didn't have a politics at that scale, you had a politics at, and one of the consequences, and this goes back to something that was said, and I think this is one of the problems I think that you will face, is that we never know when we're going to hit unintended consequences. One of the unintended consequences of Jane Jacobs was, in effect, an aesthetic and a political support for gentrification, which she did not mean, I'm sure, but the effect was that. And you can say, well, subconsciously that's what she was about, or something like that. Now, right now, the situation is, if you look at the financial markets, which are funding all of this urbanization, they are working at a temporal and financial scale which is very different from what's going on in local neighborhoods. Goldman Sachs is funding a lot of the regeneration and the investment in Mumbai. The mortgage debt in the United States, a lot of it is held by the Chinese central bank. I don't know why Americans don't get mad as hell about that. I mean, they got mad as hell when somebody from Dubai was going to buy out the port system, or the Chinese wanted to buy out an American oil company. What they don't realize is about a quarter of their housing debt is owned by the Chinese. And so when you've got something like this going on at that scale, you have to concentrate at what's going on at that scale, because the urban process is financially driven and is financially being manipulated. And so you've got to think at that scale, at the same time as you're also looking at the interactions which are going on at metropolitan scales, local scales. So there's a kind of very complicated mixture of scales, and political action, in my view, has to be cognizant of what's going on at all of these different scales in order to be able to be effective. My problem with a lot of the anti-globalization movement is it locates itself at the local scale and says, I'm not interested in all that other stuff. They're not even interested in the national scale. They basically say, state power, forget that. Our local NGO will take care of the politics, and you can say that's ridiculous. You have to actually have a politics which is a politics of scale, and we have to also think about how different spatial scales are being produced. They don't exist naturally, and what are the forces producing them? And much of what you're seeing is going on in Shanghai is not simply what's going on in China. What you're seeing there is actually tremendous kind of international financialization which is going on there. I mean, I don't know anybody in the United States, and so far as I get close to anybody in financial markets, who doesn't think China's a great place to be right now. I mean, Goldman Sachs and everybody else wants to get in there. And in return, they're prepared to give over half of Wall Street to the sovereign wealth funds, including the Chinese and the Saudis and so on. So actually they're selling out America in order to get a piece of the action in Dubai and also in that urbanization process in Dubai. This idea you're going to set up a huge financial market center there cannot occur without the complicity of the financial institutions and the financial markets. And that is so you have to look at what's going on there. So my point is not to say, oh, it's all just gone global, as if there's no complexity in that. It's a complexity of a layering of different scales of action. And within that, I think this whole kind of notion of the individual, one of the big notions that I think has to be challenged is this notion of individual autonomy. This idea that we are not socialized into the world in some way, and that we're free, autonomous individuals. And it's so interesting, you go back and look at the history of this. This was a fiction that John Locke created as a basis for liberal political theory. And even Adam Smith, when he took over John Locke, said, this is a crazy fiction because I know it's not true, but then he went on to say, but I think the world would be a better place if we all believed it was true and acted as if it was true. And we're now seeing the consequences of what happens when that's the case. The problem on Wall Street right now is nobody on Wall Street is prepared to take any kind of responsibility for what their actions are leading to. That is, they just simply say, yeah, okay, I get $150 million for screwing up the world, or I become a billionaire. That's fine. That's all that they become interested in. So that the individualistic kind of fiction becomes a reality, and to the degree it becomes so, I think all of us are likely to suffer that. Many of the social solidarities which you invoked, for example, about the early phases of what went on in northern Italy, those social solidarities disappear, and when those social solidarities disappear, we get the masses. And some of the transitions have occurred. For instance, in the United States, we've been through 3 phases. Once upon a time, a house was a home. And home meant neighbors, all those kinds of things. Then the house became a financial asset, long-term, where you tried to build and it became a major form of savings. That meant you defended your savings. In the last 20 years, housing has increasingly become an item of short-term speculative gain. Even working-class people will get a zero-down mortgage, buy a house, improve it, or not improve it, flip it 3 years later and make $20,000 and say, yep, that was very easy. So look what a house is, this transition, what a house is something that, again, is something which is taken over. And to the degree it may be taking over here, I don't know. You may have all sorts of problems with that. And that puts intense limitations on what you can do.
I think this was a very good final word. I only would like to add one aspect I mentioned, and that has to make with our discipline, this field of planners and designers. I believe that in this relationship on the different scales of the local level, reflecting the global level, and the dominance of finance capital, we have a special obligation. That is obligation to develop or to show alternatives. That it's not what we see as a dominant procedure, the dominant transformation of the world. It not the only way how the world can be transformed. If we are able to show alternatives, then we generate something that's what once called the principle of hope. We generate a utopia. And this utopia also can become reality, or in every case, partly reality in the debate about the right to this. Thank you very much for listening 2 days in this room, this debating 2 days. I hope you enjoyed it a little bit. I have now the opportunity to thank in particular all the people who contributed in a special way, and first of all the keynote speakers who contributed to this. The first, I see here Nishimura is no longer here.
Yeah, I think we'll meet tomorrow.
Later. Okay. So then another second. I have some presents here. Maybe you just bring it, otherwise I'm... Yeah. Thank you. Thorsten Schütze. Louis Chuan. Dick Kevlar. Mahmoud Jiti. Heng Shi Kiang. Mo Yong Han. Zhou Yin Zhu. Zhao Yin Zhu.